Hi, fourth graders. Here we are at the end of another theme in our reading book. So we're going to wrap up theme 3 this week by reading 2 short stories that fit into our theme just perfectly. So remember the theme that we have been working on since around Thanksgiving time was called or has been called That's Amazing. And I know I've said this every week, and it's amazing things like things that could maybe not really happen. So when we use the word amazing, it's like something fantastic, something that you wouldn't see every day, something that would probably never happen. And so we're going to read 2 more amazing stories this week. So here we are on page 382 and 382A in your hardcover reading book. We're just going to kind of summarize our theme a little bit, and then we'll get started with our first story for today. So on page 382, it says, "You have just visited a fantastic world of wands, weird weather, and wonder. A place where anything can and does happen. Now it is time to read and compare 2 more incredible selections and to practice some important test-taking skills." I'm going to skip that middle paragraph and go down to the bottom where it says, "The next 2 selections, too, will take you to places where the impossible seems possible. As you read, ask yourself what you find amazing in each one. Think about what fantastic qualities they share with the stories you have already read. And now, believe it or not, it's time for more unbelievable tales." So on page 382A, we have 2 covers of books that are part of the stories that we are going to read this week. And so the first one is called The Borrowers. We're going to read The Borrowers today. And it says, "To find out what happens when a family of tiny people meets a regular-sized boy who towers over them like a giant." And then tomorrow, we're going to read the story Lord of the Fleas, which is actually a nonfiction story, believe it or not. It is a true story about a man who trains real fleas to juggle, play soccer, and even pull miniature carts. So we're going to take a look at those 2 stories today. Before we read The Borrowers, though, let's kind of think back to the stories that we've already read in this theme. Remember, we read The Stranger, we read Cendrillon, and we read Heatwave just last week. And so all of those stories have fantastic things about them, right? The Stranger brought the weird weather. Cendrillon was a Cinderella story, which we all know is fantasy. And then last week when we read about the heat wave and the girl who fought the big heat wave rolling across her farm. So they all had something fantasy or fantastic happening in them. So before we get started reading our story, let's just look at our vocab words that go along with the story. You will have a worksheet to do with these words today, so make sure you are paying attention as I go over these words. So here are the words that we have today for our story. We have the first one, our word is draft. Then we have protruded, turmoil, object, and curious. So a current of air is called a draft. If something sticks out, it protrudes or protruded. So if you think of like a tree branch protruding from the tree trunk. If there is great confusion or commotion, there is turmoil. If something can be seen, it is an object. And if something is strange, it is another word for strange is curious. All right, so let's get started with our story, The Borrowers. Meet the incredible Clock family. Pod, Homily, and their 13-year-old daughter, Ariette, live together in an old English home, that is, under the floorboards. They fit quite comfortably there because they are the borrowers, tiny people who live unseen among humans. They survive by secretly taking or borrowing items they need from their giant neighbors. The Clocks may be in danger, though. There is a curious boy in the house who might spot them, making big trouble for them. Pod and Homily have warned young Ariette about keeping hidden, but curiosity has gotten the best of her. She strikes up a friendship with the boy. When her parents find out, they are upset and confused. Her mother, Homily, feels frightened that being seen will force them to move away. Then one night, just as the Clocks have drifted off to sleep, and Homily woke up. She saw the room again and the oil lamp flickering, but something she knew at once was different. There was a strange draft and her mouth felt dry and full of grit. Then she looked up at the ceiling. "Pod!" she shrieked, clutching his shoulder. Pod rolled over and sat up. They both stared at the ceiling. The whole surface was on a steep slant and one side of it had come right away from the wall. This was what had caused the draft. And down into the room, within an inch of the foot of the bed, protruded a curious object, a huge bar of gray steel with a flattened, shining edge. "It's a screwdriver," said Pod. They all stared at it, fascinated, unable to move, and for a moment all was still. Then slowly the huge object swayed upward until the sharp edge lay against the ceiling, and Homily heard a scrape on the floor above and suddenly a human gasp. "Oh my knees," cried Homily. "Oh my," feeling as if with a splintering wrench the whole roof flew off and fell down with a clatter somewhere out of sight. Homily screamed then, but this time it was a real scream, loud and shrill and hearty. She seemed almost to settle down in her scream, while her eyes stared up, half interested, into empty, lighted space. There was another ceiling, she realized, up above them. Higher, it seemed, than a sky. A ham hung from it and 2 strings of onions. Arietti appeared in the doorway, scared and trembling, clutching her nightgown, and Pod slapped Homily's back. "Have done," he said. "That's enough," and Homily suddenly was quiet. A great face appeared between them and the distant height. It wavered above them, smiling and terrible. There was silence, and Homily sat bolt upright, her mouth open. "Is that your mother?" asked a surprised voice after a moment, and Arietti from the doorway whispered, "Yes." It was the boy. Pod got out of bed and stood beside it, shivering in his nightshirt. "Come on," he said to Homily. "You can't stay there." But Homily could. She had her old nightdress on with the patch in the back, and nothing was going to move her. A slow anger was rising up in Homily. She had been caught in her hair curlers. Pod had raised his hand to her, and she remembered that in general turmoil, and for once in her life, she had left the supper washing up for morning, and there it would be on the kitchen table for all the world to see. She glared at the boy. He was only a child, after all. "Put it back," she said. "Put it back at once." Her eyes flashed, and her curlers seemed to quiver. He knelt down then, but Homily did not flinch as the great face came slowly closer. She saw his underlip, pink and full, like an enormous exaggeration of Arietti's, and she saw it wobble slightly. "But I've got something for you," he said. Homily's expression did not change, and Arietti called from her place in the doorway. "What is it?" The boy reached behind him, and very gingerly, careful to keep it upright, he held a wooden object above their heads. "It's this," he said, and very carefully, his tongue out and breathing heavily, he lowered the object slowly into their hole. It was a doll's dresser, complete with plates. It had 2 drawers in it and a cupboard below. He adjusted its position at the foot of Homily's bed. Arietti ran around to see better. "Oh," she cried ecstatically. "Mother, look!" Homily threw the dresser a glance. It was dark oak, and the plates were hand-painted, and then she looked quickly away again. "Yes," she said coldly, "it's very nice." There was a short silence which no one knew how to break. "The cupboard really opens," said the boy at last, and the great hand came down all amongst them, smelling of bath soap. Arietti flattened herself against the wall, and Pod exclaimed, nervous, "Now then." "Yes," agreed Homily after a moment. "I see it does." Pod drew a long breath, a sigh of relief, as the hand went back. "There, Homily," he said placatingly. "You've always wanted something like that." "Yes," said Homily. She still sat bolt upright, her hands clasped in her lap. "Thank you very much. And now," she went on coldly, "will you please put back the roof?" All right, that is the end of our story. If you're interested in reading more books like this, there is a series of The Borrowers. This is just one part of one of the books. So there's no AR quiz for this one this week because this is just a part of our story, of a bigger story. So if you're interested, you could read the Borrowers series or even the series of The Littles. If you've ever heard of The Littles, there's a large series of books called The Littles with kind of the same story of the little people hiding out in very regular places. And there are also a couple movies of The Borrowers if you are interested in checking them out sometime.